Oh, because you actually did your homework this time? Is that why you're able to?
No, actually, I have. I don't even know what we're talking about today.
If only
What
everybody
are-
could see the shock on my face that you don't feel prepared.
You know what? That just goes to show how good I am at
Yeah.
this, though. Am I right? Because I'm about to drop pearls for the next hour or so.
Welcome to the Voyage podcast, a show that traverses the oceans of myth and legend through the lens of Catholic theology and philosophy. Come aboard as we set sail in pursuit of the heroic life and Christian virtue, with your hosts, Mike Schramm and Jacob Platty.
Welcome, everybody, to this episode of the Voyage podcast, where Jacob and I are going to continue our conversation about the Mandalorian and the little way of Therese of Lisieux. We're going to not do so much of a 90-degree turn, turning away from. It's going to be kind of a similar theme from it, but going maybe a little bit deeper or focusing on something else from the Story of a Soul, which is written by Doctor of the Church, Saint Therese of Lisieux, and how it actually relates in some surprising ways to, so far, at least seasons 1 and 2 of The Mandalorian. We're recording this before season 3 has come out. And so we're just kind of, we're doing it in anticipation because we're looking forward to season 3.
This is spoilers, right? Like we're season 2's been
we're
out
talking
for years.
as if
I'm the only person.
Yeah, as if people have seen season 2. And even though you haven't seen Book of Boba Fett 5, 6, and 7, which is where the Mandalorian returns, and there are some developments there, we're going to speak as if everybody has seen everything leading up to season 3. But before we go, I just want to remind our loyal listeners, as always, don't forget to like, subscribe, and review the Voyage podcast. We know how sensitive Jacob is, and so he wants to see those 5 stars. He wants to see that. He wants to see those numbers go up. He's always asking, how are the numbers looking? How are so?
Yeah, I'm a real number cruncher. That's right. I will never see any of your comments. Just so everyone's tracking on that, though. I will.
Don't worry.
I'm just not tracking.
I'll give him the highlights.
Yeah. So any quality control issues with my performance on this podcast, just direct those over to Mike, and I'm sure he'll get back to me.
Absolutely.
In a manner that won't crush my soul.
I am very insensitive. That's the other thing to keep in mind. I actually, sometimes people will be like, "Oh, we have to protect the talent." We'll kind of not make the comments sound so bad. I'm actually going to make them sound worse than they actually are.
Yeah, that's good. Hey, you know what? The best protection is a thick skin.
All right.
And so the more you belittle me, Mike, the more you just grind me into the dust, the stronger I will come back, stronger than you can possibly imagine.
Oh,
how's
my
that
gosh,
for a Star Wars reference?
And like you said, you're not even prepared.
Boom.
That was just off the cuff.
Off the cuff, man.
So what the direction I wanted this part 2 conversation of The Mandalorian, if you remember last time, we were talking about, we kind of did an introduction to Therese of Lisieux and Story of the Soul. But one of the big things that she's known for is called the little way. And one of the best ways that can be described or defined or characterized is it's small actions done with great love, which in one sense, it's nothing new about the Christian spiritual life. And yet, we have Therese of Lisieux who comes on to the scene, or this becomes popularized in the late 1800s. And it has this massive movement behind it where you have these spiritual giants, theologians of the church, people with multiple, theology degrees behind their names. And they're looking to her as, this incredible teacher of Christian spirituality.
So in practice, does that mean that people were like making pilgrimages to her cell? I mean, like, what does it look like? What did that movement look like?
So, if you remember, just a very quick review, this is a diary, basically, is what Story of a Soul is. This is not a systematic theological textbook. This is a diary.
Wait, but people were still writing letters to her and things like that. Yeah. I guess my question is, was she popular in her lifetime?
No,
or was
it wasn't even published until after her lifetime, and she died at like 24 years old. So in terms of, the impact has all been after her death. Now, when I say the impact, why I'm highlighting that Story of a Soul is a diary is because it was never meant to be this, again, treatise on spiritual theology or treatise on theology. And yet you have all of these, dissertations that are written because of it. You have all of these saints who have looked to it as this was an inspiration for my own work. and they wouldn't say my own work as a saint, but the churches now recognize them as saints. So, two
So did
modern
they have
examples.
to? Well, do they have to remove all the elements from her diary? They're like, oh, Corey totally said hi to me today
Yeah. So,
in gym, and
okay.
Becky totally
When I say
made fun of me in the lunchroom.
Yeah, something like that.
They just cut all this stuff out.
Ironically, so I know you're bringing it up
Or
as
is
a
that
joke.
the most spiritually? Is that the most poignant spiritual content?
So because it's called The Little Way, right? And so even those, and not that it's as trivial as what you were describing, but there are these little stories in there of these.
Tell that to my kids, man. You tell them that's trivial.
So
what Corey says matters, Mike.
It sounds like you're on like a 90s after school TV show. So in her diary, which it wasn't meant to be this thing like that she just happened to have kept her entire life and then they saved it. She was instructed to write these things down from her superior. But to go back to your point, it included these seemingly trivial examples from her day or from her life that most people would have just forgotten about or not seen the spiritual value of. And it was precisely because she saw the spiritual value in those that it became so influential to others. Because if this person who seemingly lived this very ordinary, not like just not very influential life, or didn't seem to have this profound spirituality in her everyday life, if she was able to recognize that, then could I recognize or see the opportunities for spiritual growth in my own ordinary everyday life? So, like, to go back to your point, like, it does have those sorts of entries where it's like, so-and-so and I were just cleaning the floor and blah, blah, blah. Or I was faced with this proposition of, could I, say something or not say something? And I didn't say something. And, I not to belittle it, but like the whole offer it up sort of thing. And it's like to be able to think through that, that opportunity and put words to it was very profound and influential. Two modern saints from the Western tradition, which again, even if you're not part of this tradition, they've been recognized the world over as very influential. Examples of charity would be Mother Teresa, who actually she chose the name Mother Teresa, but she wanted to go by Therese because she was so influenced by Therese of Lisieux. And then Pope St. John Paul II. So again, two saints who have been canonized in like the last 20 years, both look at the story of a soul as part of the, just huge influences in their spirituality.
No, it's interesting. So like I teach Sunday school, right? And my kids are in my Sunday school class because I go to a small church. And so it's pretty much all the kids are in the same classroom. Which you think it's tough teaching high schoolers, Mike. Try teaching high schoolers and preschoolers simultaneously.
Ooh.
I defy you. Anyway, but so we were talking about, we're leading up into Lent, right? It's right around the corner for us. And we're talking about repentance. And in Greek, that's metanoia. And then in Hebrew, I don't think I'll remember the word, but it's like shuv or something like that. Or turv, maybe. I don't know. But we were going over what those words mean in their original languages. And in Hebrew, it means to turn around. It means to like walk a different direction. So it's like this embodied physical reality. In Greek, metanoia means to think twice, to, stop and think again kind of concept. So it's more of a mental thing. And then, I like the idea of combining both of those concepts where repentance becomes something that you is both a bodily embodied act in your life, but also a mental spiritual reality as well. And my kids were like, that's way too abstract. They were basically critiquing me, like saying, hey, like, how does this play out?
Get your head out of the clouds, old man.
Yeah. Quit screaming up there, bro. Even up to the point of what Therese was able to give people, it sounds like, is this idea of it bringing it into practical application. Someone like myself, I tend to have my head in the clouds all the time, and so I as I'm thinking these things through at this kind of like mental reality, I think I could benefit a lot more from the actual application.
Well,
and I think that's what this
and
is
actually, so to that point as well, like when you asked about the influence, and I immediately jumped into, well, here are these saints and their writings, or people have written all these books about it. And those are certainly true. And that's one indicator, but maybe the better indicator of the influence Therese has had on the Catholic world in the last 200 years is what's always the stereotypical Catholic name. It's always Mary Therese, Bernadette Therese, Therese. Like, so it became the stereotype that the stereotypical Catholic family, if they had a bunch of daughters, or even all of the daughters, would all have the name Therese, like as their middle name or something. And so that probably more than anything else indicates the influence that Therese of Lisieux, and like you said, specifically the little way, how it related to the every person, right? The everyday Christian, the everyday Catholic, more so. Now, why I brought up my example is because it's not an either or. It was that this was so profound that not only did it affect the everyday, little way, spirituality.
So like somebody like Mother Teresa, she's not known for being a theologian. She's known for being, a servant, right? Then obviously Pope John Paul II, he was a pretty dynamic theologian, was he not?
Philosopher, theologian, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, right.
So
you basically have the gamut. You have the spectrum of two of the most influential Catholics of the 20th century. And they're completely different in what they're kind of like, quote unquote, known for. And yet they have the common wellspring of the humble writings of this monastic, who, didn't get published until after she was dead.
And yeah, that just the fact that, and I know we covered this last time too, but that she was declared by the church to be a doctor of the church, which, there's only been, I think, 39 in the 2,000-year history of the church, 39 who have been given this title as their
yeah, you hand them out like candy over there. I get it.
Yeah, I know. It's even more
anyone's
exclusive
a doctor.
Over there, but
everyone's a doctor in the Catholic Church.
So anyway, the main thing that for this one, in connecting it to the Mandalorian, I don't know if you remember, but we're actually going to talk about the Mandalorian a little bit.
I'm excited. Yeah. I've been patiently waiting to get through all this Catholic stuff.
Yeah.
So I can get to the real conversation I want to have, which is talking about season 2 of The Mandalorian.
Well, and actually, we're going to go back to 1 as well. It's the whole, but
I can do that.
So the connection I wanted to draw, or that I thought was interesting, was, we've been talking about how this little way, it's not just that it connects to the every person, but that there's this actual unexpected spiritual power in it. Not just that everybody can associate with it, but that it actually has a huge influence on the spiritual life. And we see that same, even if you want to say in a metaphorical sense, this same unexpected spiritual power in so much of The Mandalorian, right? I mean, just think of like, we've talked a little bit about how the child, this little character, or the littleness of has, every episode packs this punch. So every 30, 40-minute episode packs this huge punch. But even within the story itself, it's the power within these unexpected areas that kind of makes The Mandalorian what it is. Wouldn't you say?
No, I would. And I think it's all right. So here's the thing: is I currently have a almost 9-month-old baby right now, and so frankly, I'm experiencing watching through The Mandalorian with little baby Grogu. Actually possessing a child that's roughly approximate to the behavior pattern of Grogu in that show.
Eats everything too,
and and it pulls like I'm so primed for the stories that Mandalorian is telling because of where I happen to be at this moment in my life right now. Probably more so than if I didn't currently have a baby.
Because we didn't even get into the whole dad stuff. But yeah, like the whole dad.
No, I know. And so the entire arc, everything about it is me as a father connecting with the Mandalorian and, just getting way more emotional than I probably should at this show. I tell you what, all right, so we're going to talk about the final episode of that show for a couple minutes. But B, the end, man. What is it? Niagara Falls,
the
baby.
Ugly tears.
Well, you get the reference from Scrooge. Everyone go watch Scrooge next Christmas. But
the Bill Murray one.
Bill Murray's character. Yeah, the Bill Murray one. Niagara Falls, baby. Taxi Driver, Ghost of Christmas Past. Anyway, dude, just
We're not as
ugly
cultured as
face
you are,
crying.
apparently.
Yeah. Scrooge has been around for quite a few decades now, so catch up. But man, that was, and then he takes the helmet off, which we should talk about that too. But despite my questions about his newfound liberal attitude with his helmet by the end of that season,
And that has consequences in the Book of Boba Fett, by the way.
Oh, I suspect. I'm sure they're going to play into those questions. But, setting aside all of that, emotionally speaking, I mean, it's just, it's devastating. And little Grogu, he goes and he caresses his cheek, with his little puppet hand.
And even that.
But they do such a good job animating the child to, like, when my child is sitting around, his dexterity's not there yet. And he's, he basically is, I feel like my... watching The Mandalorian makes me view my real baby as like a puppet creature.
Well, actually, I've started to resonate with
suddenly he feels like
so I've
that.
got a 14-month-old, and he climbs everywhere where he's not supposed to, which is very much resonant with the Baby Yoda Grogu character as well.
Oh yeah, for sure. And just the expressions that they get and things like that. Anyway, so it's obviously a very personal experience for me right now. But that final episode was amazing. Well, let's get to the final episode stuff, but let's talk about the helmet thing. And I'm I know this doesn't necessarily tie back to Therese, but just as a pop culture podcast from a Catholic or classical Christian perspective, I'm wondering kind of where they're going with this character.
Okay.
Because the one thing that I really enjoyed from season 1 was the honor and the tradition and the kind of unequivocal, what's the word I want to use? Promotion of
and like
that
the reverence,
type of a
reverence
lifestyle.
for the way,
The reverence,
right? And
yeah.
reverence for the way that, in this, it was the way not to remove your helmet. So what's the conflict that's going to be created there? And as I've already kind of alluded to, it does get addressed in the episodes 5, 6, and 7 of Book of Boba Fett. In one sense, I'm not totally surprised because it's kind of a reflection of like modern or postmodern culture to kind of like undo all of those, tradition for tradition's sake. It's tradition we don't remove the helmet, so now we're going to have our main guy remove the helmet because then you as the viewer have to feel conflict.
Specifically into it. Yeah. So season 1 does a really good job of investing the audience in believing in this creed, right?
Yeah.
And it's fascinating that they use that language, that they use openly religious language throughout the show to describe the Mandalorian.
You can't get,
it's
in
very
one sense,
spiritual.
you can't get more New Testament biblical because that predates even Christian, calling it Christian. So calling it the way.
Well, and here's what I'll say. I'm actually more impressed by their use of the word creed because it's such a specifically religious word to use. The way, as much as it is, loaded with spiritual baggage as a term.
You could see some Buddhism there too, so.
Yeah, but I mean, and you could see someone who's not particularly religious still adopting that type of language because it's an easy word to use, right? But to really lean into the religiosity of their way of life by describing what they do as a creed.
No, that's definitely got more baggage.
Yeah, very unique. I mean, it's a very specific word to use. And then in season 2, you even have this idea that there's actually different sects of Mandalorian, different denominations, if you will.
Yeah.
The one with Cara Thrace from Battlestar Galactica is, as she calls them, religious zealots. Right? And so it's almost like she belongs to non-denominational Mandalorianism.
Oh, nice.
Like
a charismatic or something.
Yeah. Yeah, she's a charismatic. I don't need to go to church. I can experience the way without my helmet. Like I don't need to do the practices of this organized religion.
We gotta do ecclesiology of the Mandalorian.
I'm telling you, this is the stuff that I was picking up on as I was watching season 2, is because season 1, they do a good job of honoring it and treating it with respect. But season 2 introduces a ton of kind of deconstructive elements that they don't They don't lean too heavily into it until like the last couple episodes, though.
Well, and I think
when he's starting to get confronted with these gray realities, do I save the child or do I preserve my creed?
Well, and I think too, one of the things that, and this is why, one could argue, oh, it's postmodern deconstruction for the sake of deconstruction, or, subverting tradition because tradition needs to be subverted. But there is even a place for those sorts of things if it's all things, sacrifice all things for the sake of charity, right? True charity. And so,
right.
Lest anybody think
I would argue,
that we're just complaining about it because, oh, it's modernism, blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, we can even see the potential value. And season 2, I think, like you said, it addresses a lot of those things, but it isn't wholly disrespectful of those things either, right? You can definitely see
I'll
why.
be curious to see. It's where they go with it. It'll entirely depend upon where they go with it. Because as of right now, I am not so offended at the idea that they are moving into murky waters with Mandalorian's creed. Because that's interesting storytelling, right? So, like, okay, you've established that this person belongs to a code and that he treats that code with the utmost respect. He'd rather die than, and then what gets him to change from someone who would rather die for their code into somebody who's willing to make exceptions. And okay, so at least in the Orthodox Church specifically, we have this term economia that gets thrown around a lot. Yeah. I'm sure the Catholics have it too. It's kind of a joke. It's kind of a meme within the Orthodox world, though, because economia tends to be the Orthodox Church is just a little bit more loosey-goosey than the Catholic Church in a lot of ways. Just
it becomes sort of an excuse to do whatever you want. Is that?
Yeah, the economia argument.
We call that being pastoral over on this side.
It's very much the same concept. We just have a fancy Greek word for it. But basically, economy being like within the house.
Yep.
Like the house rules. And so basically, okay, well, you don't have to fast today because of this reason. Whatever, we're gonna let that slide. And it's more of a relationship you have with your spiritual director, like your parish priest, for example. And then he works economia in the day-to-day, right? Mm-hmm. And so that sense of, and I'm sure the Catholic Church has
No. What you're describing, there's certainly, parallels. I wouldn't even say parallels as if it's like they're in two different tracks. I would say it's the same track. But yeah.
It's the same. Yeah, it's the same concept, I'm sure. And so I can see these, or so for example, there's that moment later on when the Mandalorian has to choose between getting the information he needs to save Grogu or removing his helmet. Mm-hmm. And it's a really dramatic moment in the show because you've never seen the Mandalorian make a choice like that. And then he does. And they're almost Hitchcockian in how well they wait to see if other people notice him. Because at first he removes the helmet. It's like, okay, well, maybe nobody will see his face. And then he can still keep his honor, right? But no, they drag him through the mud, basically. They say, okay, yeah, he made this choice, and he's going to suffer.
They make him take a bunch of selfies.
The humiliation.
Right? No.
They do, yeah. They really humiliate him in that moment. And so there's a bit of a passion going on there for the Mandalorian.
And like
when he's
not to trivialize that either. Like it's certainly a passion of the ego, right? It's a crucifixion of the ego in that sense.
Well, and so the only fear I have is that they'll take what's an interesting conversation about how do you remain true to your creed and when do the exceptions arise that it's okay for the greater good into, well, the creed was just never necessary to begin with. And let's see where they go with it, because they could, right now they're kind of walking that line, I think. At the end of the show, when he removes his helmet to say goodbye to Grogu, emotionally, it's such a gut punch and it's such a good moment. And I was just, I loved it. I loved that moment. But philosophically speaking,
it seems less necessary.
It's less necessary. And it's like, okay, well, I understood the dramatic tension in the previous episode. It's like, but are you just like done? Are you just done with that creed? Where are you going with this? And it can still be an exceptional moment, and it would be an exceptional moment if he proceeds to no longer keep taking his helmet off.
Yeah. Well,
and you know what? I'm afraid. Like I just have this sinking feeling that this is going to be a show in which the Mandalorian slowly evolves into a more Protestant form of Mandalorianism,
Or
because
where it's just becomes
all those old creeds were just religious zealotry.
It just becomes a way in my image as opposed to me conforming myself to the way, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Absolutely.
that's obviously, I mean, we could certainly wax poetic on the dangers of that in the Christian life, which is kind of the whole idea of making these parallels, right? Is
No, and it could be to the point. This is why economy is so important, or pastoral care is so important. Is the tradition is not an idol. The tradition is there to raise us up to the spiritual levels we're supposed to be at, and as such should be taken with the most sincerity.
And even in your,
but it's not something that crushes us.
Even in your description, when you were talking about how this looks from the eastern side, and like I said, that's why this is a parallel to the West. It's always done in the context of obedience. So that's why you mentioned, your parish priest, or even your spiritual director, or from a priest standpoint, his bishop.
Yeah.
And so,
yeah, it's supposed to be given to you. The economy is given to you. You don't take it upon yourself.
And
you don't.
Tying this back in again. So that's actually, we were talking about the writing of the story of a soul, and it wasn't something that she wasn't just keeping a diary out of vanity. Like, she was directed by her superior to write this down for posterity. And so even this work of, like I said, not originally meant to be systematic theology or spiritual theology. It was a work of obedience. And that's probably, in a sense, you can't help but say that's part of that went into the formation of it. I think she says, like, right at the beginning of it, that she's writing these things down, not because she thinks her insights are so great, but because she was instructed to, which again, I think is just as much, even though it wasn't meant to be explicit content in terms of spiritual theology, that adds as much to it that was the context. Right, that she was doing it, just as much that she was doing it out of obedience. That teaches us something indirectly as well.
Oh, I think so.
So
no, it does, and so it'll be interesting to see how they carry through with his evolution, and maybe we'll see more of that in the Boba Fett show that you've been describing. I'll have to catch up on that here pretty quick.
Well, yeah, because he does have to, like, confront the remaining members of his order.
Oh yeah, so they actually go and they find out, evidently, huh? What did it get on the internet? The old selfies get on the internet.
yeah.
Post them. What the other people in the room, the other Mandalorians, like him. Recording it, on TikTok.
So he basically admits to
Mando. That's what happens, man.
It's
once it's on the internet, it's there forever. Whole world's the whole galaxy.
That's a lesson.
No matter how far away, is going to see.
That's a lesson to us just as much.
Keep that in mind.
Man, Star Wars, so profound.
It is.
So one of the main examples from the story of a soul that I wanted to bring up in terms of this unexpected spiritual power, it actually has to do with, Saint Therese, she's kind of describing how this little way works in terms of how can one actually progress, because again, on the surface, it doesn't look like you're actually doing anything spiritual or you're actually doing anything valuable when it comes to spirituality.
Yeah.
But she talks about how, growing up, she grew up in a devout Catholic home, and she was always told stories of the saints. She read to stories of the saints by her parents, her siblings. Actually, both of her parents. I don't know if they've been canonized saints or if they've been beatified, but I think they've been canonized as well. Therese of Lisieux's parents. But she talks about how growing up, she'd hear these stories of these great saints, how they did these great things, or they had these incredible insights. They grew and advanced in the spiritual life. But she was never going to be that. She was never going to do these, great things, again, on the surface, seemingly great things. And she compared it to, like, when we have this big mountain, right? And the saints, these are these great mountain climbers, and they're climbing up the mountain because of all the spiritual gifts they've been given. But she doesn't have these same gifts. But what happens is she only reaches her arms up, and God lifts her up and carries her up. And so now this little way is not her.
Hey, it's just like that poem, or whatever you want to call it, Footprints.
Yep, that was so.
Just like that. All right, so hear this one. Stop me if you've heard this one before,
please,
Mike.
No.
But at the end of the life, the person looks back on the beach.
Why were there only one set?
Sees one set? There's only one set of footprint. during his hardest, darkest times, Mike. What's up with that, Jesus? You'll never see this coming.
No.
Those were the moments Jesus was carrying him, Mike.
So Therese saw this.
I mean, that's a great way to end this episode, right? We can't get better than that.
Like that.
This is
and in one sense, it's probably the end of the episode because everybody stopped listening. So, yeah, you could say it's the end.
I shouldn't make fun of that story. I'm pretty sure my beloved aunt has that on her wall. It's a nice story. Hey, Therese, she totally. So anyway, she ripped that off though. She was in the gift shop at the monastery, and she saw that, and she's like, "Oh, I'm gonna put that in my diary.
I just got to change the words a little bit.
Change the details. Got to change the details so people don't pick up on this."
So, and of course, the ironic thing is because she's being
never
lifted,
meet your heroes. Kids.
Not only is she exerting less effort, again to keep the metaphor, but she gets lifted up higher than those who are climbing, and so. It of course speaks to the value of it. She called the little way her elevator to Jesus, or because that's
that's funny.
So so there again, it's the unexpected spiritual power you wouldn't expect to find. I mean, you wouldn't expect to see it in the example, like in the little life, the everyday sorts of things. And I think even just the fact we've already kind of talked a little bit about how there was this unexpected power in the child, right? Maybe Star Wars fans maybe expected it because the child looked like Yoda. So you're like, oh,
he's a baby
Yoda. It's gonna be a Jedi, or it's gonna have the Force or something.
Yeah, for sure.
I did think it was. So if you remember in season 1, it was the blood that the bad guys wanted. Do you remember? They wanted to drain the blood.
Yeah, they did. They wanted his blood.
Which, I mean, definitely has a sort of Old Testament Levitical sacrifice aspect to it, right?
The
life is in the blood. Or the midichlorians are in the blood.
There's also the midichlorians are in the blood. Yikes.
Yeah,
wow.
That's a paraphrase. That's how they'll do the Lego Bible or the Star Wars Bible. So in the Star Wars Bible, that's the translation. The midichlorians are in the blood.
That's what it is. The midichlorians are in the blood.
Yeah.
They even say M count or something like that, and it's you won't say that dirty word, will you? Yeah, you're just gonna say M count. Well, they won't actually say what they're talking about.
I know it's.
But it's interesting that they're trying to, they're trying to clone. They're trying to make a super race, like super soldier serum, out of baby Grogu's blood, so that you have a bunch of force wielding stormtroopers. That's kind of the impression.
Yeah, it's kind of it's a manufactured, magic or manufactured spiritual power, right?
Yeah, they're trying to turn the grace of the Force into a commodity that can be, manufactured like a technology.
Well, and I mean, we've had
spiritual perils.
Well, that's just it, right? I mean, it's so what? Maybe the real theme should have been simony. Is that the?
That's basically
that was the real sin of the Empire. The real sin of the Empire was simony. Nobody saw that coming, did they?
True.
Now what we needed.
We are really digging up some pretty interesting information for this podcast.
We needed the I can't remember the bad guy's name, the Giancarlo Esposito, the guy who played Fring in Breaking Bad. We need him to just straight up look at the camera and be like, now everybody, just a reminder, the real sin was simony. And be like, so, hey, you know what? Google searches for simony would have skyrocketed, if only, right?
Right. No, I know. Now all of you listening to this are going to have to Google it and find out what we're talking about, because we're going to make you do that.
Oh,
this is your homework for this season.
Oh gosh, don't tell them. If you're the example,
don't
telling
give people
them,
homework.
I mean,
do as I say, not as I do. I'm pretty sure that's great advice.
Something like that.
Something like that. So he ends up falling back on, and it's an interesting, honestly. At some point later on, when we're talking about something Star Wars related again, we'll have to talk about what makes the Empire evil. And what an interesting kind of case study the Empire is. One of the things, though, that I think is pretty pertinent for ourselves today is that its use of technology as it's like a technocratic empire, right? And it's going to bring order and peace to the galaxy through
tyranny.
Tyranny, but it's but it's also a kind of technological embrace. It's, you almost get, and I don't think this is ever explicitly said, I haven't read a lot of like Star Wars comics or novels or anything like that, and I'm sure they flesh out a lot of details in those things. But if you're just watching the TV or the movie mediums, I don't think I've ever heard this said anywhere. But the impression you get from just the overall nature of who the good guys are and the bad guys are is the bad guys are the highly technologically advanced overlord people,
Yeah.
the tyrannical one percenters, basically.
Mhm.
And all of your good guys are always these impoverished, people just trying to scrape a living, right? Trying to make it by underneath like the jackboot of this very well-resourced, technologically driven, kind of empire.
And ideologically
Um,
driven, right? I mean, that's also one of the big
and
things they
ideologically
emphasize
driven.
just in the language of the characters of the Empire. And it's always hard for me to differentiate between, am I talking original trilogy or am I talking, because you don't really hear about the Empire, obviously, in episodes 1, 2, and 3. But in 7, 8, and 9,
Well,
too, I think you get a lot of that. And for whatever complaints people have, like maybe the ideological language is a little bit too heavy handed. And that's maybe why I'm thinking of those ones. But
well, not necessarily. What I will say though is like specifically the ideology that's on display is a kind of secular ideology.
yeah, well, definitely in episode 4.
The Force using, well,
Yeah.
all throughout it. Back to episode 4, like you said, when your lack of faith is most disturbing or whatever. But the idea, like even going up to like episode 7 or something like that. Oh wait, no, it would be episode 7. When you're seeing the new order come together and things like that, that's an interesting phrase, the new order. It invokes this idea of like a new world order type thing, which in and of itself is this kind of progressive, we're going to manufacture peace on earth. We're going to bring heaven to earth through our will, through our technology, through our science, kind of concept.
Well, it's the whole like
And
putting nature on
the
the rack
Empire,
sort of thing. And yeah.
right? Instead of just grinding out your day in peaceful subsistence, at the local level kind of
Well,
thing,
and you even get
where all the
the
good people seem to live.
and you even get the, I mean, they're in different ways it's sort of emphasized more or less, but the whole like in harmony, which I know that can sometimes cause like an eye roll or whatever, but like there's very much an emphasis on harmony. Even when it comes to
Absolutely.
the use of these spiritual powers, you kind of talked about how there was this desire to mechanize or whatever, or co-opt.
Well, that's what we're going to
power
get
of the
back
Force.
to when it comes to.
Well,
to bring it back to season 2, we'll get there. But go on,
and
sorry.
actually, no. So if you think of like even the lightsaber, in one sense, it's kind of this balance between the two because it's very much an artificial, right? In terms of it's a handmade sort of thing, but it's wielding this spiritual power, but it's done in a way that harmonizes it, right? I mean, obviously, if it's the Jedi who are the main ones that carry it, even though it can be used by the bad guys too, right?
Well, and if you know your Star Wars nerdery, there's kyber crystals inside those things.
So that's again.
And so even the weapon itself is not like a circuit board.
Yeah.
The weapon itself is basically a holder for something that's sacred.
It's the mechanical and the magic together.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the balance of the two. And it's what technology should be for Christians, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like there's nothing wrong with the internet and there's nothing wrong with cell phones, but they are magical devices and it's a magical system. It's literally a spiritual world, right?
It reminds me of
the internet
there's kind of like a funny meme that kind of speaks to that idea where we always talk about if we could speculate going back, 500 or 1,000 years and how we'd amaze people with our technology. And then they would ask us about that technology and we'd be just as clueless. We'd be like, so we'd go and show them a cell phone and they'd be like, oh, how does this work? And be like, electricity.
Well, I've even heard said that like no one person actually knows. This sounds made up maybe, so it's probably made up. I'm sure it's possible to know, but I'm going to roll with it anyway. No one person knows how an iPhone works. Well, no, I mean, and so
Jacob
even whether this is true or not,
I'll tell you. Yeah, okay.
He's an idiot. But because it's basically what Apple's done has taken people's, different component elements that they've developed or whatever and organized them in a way that creates an iPhone. but you need all these different people, and no one person.
You know what
can
this
make an
reminds me
iPhone.
of, actually? So
Huh.
you're saying how like no one person knows, and how it took this huge, like, everybody working on these things separately, and they were all brought together. And I was like, that's just like the translation of the Septuagint, right? Where it was the 70 Jewish
Yeah, there
scholars
you
came
go.
together in Alexandria,
Nice.
like, what was it, 200 years before Jesus or so? And they
right.
all had to make a separate translation. And the fact that they all were able to bring it together as one, that was the miracle, according to the Jewish people. And that's why that became the version of the Old Testament that was primarily used by Jesus, or used, during the time of Jesus and the apostles. And it's also why, it's the version with the 7 deuterocanonical books that you'll see in quote unquote Catholic Bibles or Catholic Old Testaments.
You're preaching to the Orthodox choir.
Well, I didn't want to
over
make
here,
it exclusive
Mike.
by saying that. I just didn't want to speak beyond my beyond my depth.
That's basically our Latin Vulgate.
Yeah.
It's our primary.
I just love that.
text.
As you were describing it, I was like, oh my gosh, people could use that same parallel to the Septuagint and
That's
be like,
quite funny.
hey, it's just like when we made the iPhone. Like, no, but actually,
but anyway,
no, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say that what the heck was I gonna say?
Well, we were originally talking
I guess you
about.
go ahead because I lost.
Well, we were originally, because just kind of keep it on brand, right? Keep it on theme. This episode was about the unexpected spiritual power, and we were talking about how there's this harmony between the artificial, or the mechanized, and the magical
crystals and
when
the
it came to the
lightsaber,
lightsaber
right.
itself, right? And it's talking about how it's a handmade thing in terms of the handle, but it's using the kyber crystals that creates it. That's what makes it what it is, right? And what's funny is,
and it's not they're not replacing nature. They're harnessing nature. Kind of like, even going back to the Garden of Eden story, where it's one of my favorite analogies to keep going back to, or spiritual realities to keep going back to, is that we're fundamentally cultivators. That we're not here to steamroll the environment. We're here to live within the environment, but also to cultivate it into a habitable home.
So you become a steward,
and that includes the stuff we use.
You're a steward of the kyber crystals, to keep the analogy.
That's exactly it. That's exactly it.
So, but what's funny is, and I realize, you haven't seen the Book of Boba Fett episodes, but if you remember at the end of Mandalorian season 2, he gets the dark saber, right? And
they do a stinger where he goes and sits in Jabba's throne.
So he
they do have that,
but in
post-credit sequence.
But the Mandalorian, you actually see him use it in combat in episode 5 of Book of Boba Fett. And what's interesting is that it's said to him afterwards, because in his combat, he actually injures himself with it. And it's said to him later on, you cannot control it with your strength in wielding the dark saber.
Interesting.
And so you get this sense of like, almost like an Aikido sort of thing, where it's like, you have to control it, but you can't try to overpower it. You can't try to like impose yourself upon it, which, as you were saying,
you have to participate with it. You have to have
that's what this, whether we're talking about why the dark side wanted Grogu's blood, or what the dark side has always been about, which has been an overpowering, or imposing its will upon the galaxy, imposing its will upon the Force, as opposed to
it's all just matter to be wielded,
and
none of it is a living reality that you participate with.
And so the Mandalorian, even though he doesn't necessarily, that's not necessarily his MO, he still has to learn this with this device, with the dark saber, that he can't just overpower this thing. He can't just treat it like, the quote unquote bad guys treat they just see everything as either a weapon or something to be controlled. And
something to be used. Yeah, something to be consumed. So the Empire is just modernity, folks. It's just modernity. And it's not that like technology is bad. Obviously, everyone in Star Wars uses technology, spaceships, communicators, all that stuff. It's not like the technology is bad, but how people utilize. Some people are living with technology, and some people are wielding technology across the galaxy against, for the act of coercion and things like that, to make peace through the galaxy, quote unquote. But it's under the jackboot.
I was gonna. Well, now that you use the phrase jackboot, which of course should remind you, or remind us of when we were talking about the long time episode that we recorded, because that's what the Bill character says at the beginning. And you were talking earlier, it reminded me of I was like, oh, it's a redemption story told through a blah 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 story, because that was kind of our kind of back and forth earlier. And
Yeah.
what's funny
Yeah.
is there's actually some sincerity to this because, you've been talking about how he removed his helmet and how, that's going to cause problems later on, or what are the consequences going to be? So it actually, I think his conversation when he's confronted with this, with the consequences of him removing his helmet, sets us up for what I'm guessing will be the main storyline, or one of the main storylines in Mandalorian season 3, because he says that the only way to basically be forgiven or redeemed from this discretion is he has to go to the living waters under the mines of Mandalore. And it's like, oh my gosh,
What?
living waters. Like, I wonder if there's any sort of, yeah. And I had to write it down because I was like, that's the language they're going to use.
Wow.
So like I said,
who is on the writing team? It's Jon Favreau. Like half the episodes seem to be written by that
or
guy.
directed, or I mean, the whole like the direction of the series as a whole.
No, but specifically written,
Yeah.
like specifically written by Jon Favreau. I noticed frequently.
Which again,
wow.
it'll
Okay.
be good. It'll set us up well for a season. Obviously we won't be able to record the episode until the whole season comes out, which is as of this recording is at least 6 weeks away. But however many episodes the season's gonna have. But
That should
I had
be
to
interesting
write it,
because it'll basically be after Lent too,
oh
which we'll have both gone through. Well, me more so than Mike, frankly.
Oh boy.
We'll have gone through
Some penance, some
I don't know.
some
I'm
actual
sure
times of
Mike's gonna do
prayer,
a lot.
yeah.
I think Mike's gonna do something. I don't know what it is, but he'll do something, I'm sure. But like that's gonna be a pilgrimage, right? And it'll be interesting to watch The Mandalorian in that context.
I didn't I tell you that, our church is just taking Lent off this year. We're just going to be like, it's more of a, oh boy, no, I'm going to get the emails.
You're with I don't need the helmet.
Yeah,
Who needs
yep.
the helmet? I'm going to worship God in my own way.
Out in nature, right? Just like the Mandalorian would have wanted.
Right, absolutely. That's exactly it. No, I'm glad you guys are figuring that out over there. But before, because I know we're getting long in this episode, I got to vent about how amazing Luke Skywalker's reappearance was.
Yeah.
So I am one of those people who was turned off by The Last Jedi. And people can sit there and accuse me of being hobbled by my, slavish dedication to the character arc of the original trilogy and how characters evolve and it makes an interesting narrative story. People change and that's interesting. Luke Skywalker was always supposed to be, conversations about him turning to the dark side. Yeah, I've heard it all. I've heard it all, people. I don't buy any of it. Luke Skywalker is a jerk in The Last Jedi. He betrays everything he stands for in the original trilogy. And you can say that's interesting narrative development, but that's lazy storytelling when you don't earn any of that. And you can say, oh, well, bad things happened and he lost all of his pupils and he went crazy. Not good enough. Not good enough to get us from Luke Skywalker at the end of Return of Jedi to Luke Skywalker at the beginning of The Last Jedi. I do not buy that arc, and it was extremely frustrating.
Silver lining, though, it made for some really funny memes about the whole characters. So that's the Force working in mysterious
there's always
ways.
that. There's always that's what that is. That's
oh my
right.
God, honestly, I'm actually surprised somebody has somebody said the Force works in mysterious ways. That feels like such a like somebody in somebody in the Star Wars stories is going to say that. Hopefully Ahsoka says it. Then everybody can roll their eyes and groan.
Yeah, right. Oh, we never even got to her appearance. But anyway, let me keep waxing on about Luke. So that was so cathartic for me to see Luke Skywalker. Yeah, I mean the digital de-aging was a little uncanny valley creepy.
Oh yeah,
I admit. But I was so invested in the story at that point, it didn't matter. It was easy for me to ignore it. And so putting that little canard aside, that was such a cathartic way to redeem Luke, even though in the larger context, it's done nothing. The Last Jedi is still canon. It's still where he goes. But that's what Luke should be. And that's the Luke that, frankly, we never really got a chance to see post Return of the Jedi, because Return of the Jedi, he's still ultimately, there's very little of him being super Jedi, except for at the very end when he's fighting his father.
Extended conversation. Yeah.
There's not, you just don't get the joy of watching Luke Skywalker at his height. The height of his powers is just being awesome. And so for someone, Jon Favreau, to finally give us that was amazing. And it was awesome. And they had set up, we were talking about technology and the Empire's dedication to technology. The reason why that was even brought up initially was because the ultimate baddies in this season are those Terminator style
the robots,
stormtrooper droids, right? Yeah, and to my mind, it was just like a platoon of Terminators, right? Which I think is a super neat idea. What happens if the Empire just institutes a bunch of Terminator type things? And that's how the Mandalorian kind of engages with him. I was getting flashbacks to Sarah Connor trying to like fight the Terminator.
The foot stepping on the skull and breaking it, right?
There's all kinds of, it's very Terminator-y, which is cool. I like it. And for Luke Skywalker to show up and just take out an entire ship full of Terminators nonchalantly,
and that's the other thing,
was just so awesome.
Yeah, like
it's so cool.
Well, yeah, it's like ever since probably episode 1, we're craving that. You kind of mentioned Last Samurai or Samurai. We talked about that in our first part of The Mandalorian, and so we're always looking for that like samurai scene where it's 1 on 50 and all I have is a sword or a lightsaber. And you get to just, or even, actually it kind of makes me think of, did you ever watch the Kill Bill movies? Do you remember so there's the Kill Bill, like the restaurant.
The house of, in the first movie, the house of, what do they call that?
I realized that movie or the Kill Bill story is like an homage. So I know that's not the first example, but in my life, that was the, like, you think of the one against
iconic
everybody. Yeah.
The one against everybody thing.
So we're always,
they did a good job.
And we never got to do that. We never got to see that obviously with Luke, because his main, once he becomes a Jedi master or whatever, because he doesn't really do it in the Jabba the Hutt scene.
No,
and he doesn't do it with Darth Vader. Yeah. So we got to see him do it. And we don't have to have any like moral qualms about it because it's a bunch of robots, fortunately. But we got to see him,
awesome.
He doesn't. We don't have to call Luke a murderer or a mass murderer because it was just.
I would
have
never done that anyway. But come on,
we just write it. Yeah,
I was actually just listening. There was It's this is. I've been going. I just finished actually that Planet Narnia book a while back.
Yeah.
Which was a fantastic read. But he quotes C.S. Lewis regarding something else. Is like fairy tales are when the insides of a person are on their outside. In other words, you don't have to treat bad guys with nuance. You can. Lots of stories do. Obviously, we're really fascinated with anti-heroes
and we're going to have an
treating
episode
bad guys
devoted
with
to
nuance.
Like the villains, like the motivations in the background. You saw that text I sent you.
We can do that. There's probably.
Okay.
No, I'm just kidding. I did. But Star Wars is a fairy tale. Star Wars is a space opera. Stormtroopers are like orcs.
Oh boy.
You know what? It was actually there's my token reference.
Check the box.
Yeah, that was
Anybody playing
was
bingo?
actually where it was. It was in a. That's right. It was an Am and Sewell. That's a great podcast. Go check it out. An Am and Sewell episode that was talking about the orcs. Yeah, after listening to us, of course. And they're asking, is it, how do we engage with how much orcs are just like bad guys? Are they redeemable? Blah blah blah. It was a very interesting conversation they had. But
you'll see a lot of essays and Tolkien studies stuff about it for sure.
Yeah, and the idea is that like no, they're not redeemable. They're basically demons. They're basically incarnate demons, and Christians should not be worried about the salvation of demons. Indiana Jones should not be worried about the humanity of Nazis, and Luke Skywalker should not be worried about the humanity of stormtroopers. If you want to tell a story like that, go tell something that's not Star Wars, because Star Wars is fantasy, and fantasy, the joy of fantasy. This is why Game of Thrones is okay. It's okay, but it's the absolute opposite of this, right? Game of Thrones is taking a fantasy world and dragging it into the mud of our reality, and just grinding it up. And,
it's
and
telling a modern story
like.
with fantasy characters as opposed to telling a fantasy story. Is that you know? I mean, maybe that's
it. Is absolutely. It's different. It's not the same thing. And so fantasies, our most beloved fantasies are they're morality tales. And there's good and there's evil. There's black hats and white hats, and it's unrepentantly so. you know, you don't have to worry about the bad guys. You know, they're just there to pillage and murder and rape, and just leave it at
Or
that.
to be cut in half by a lightsaber.
Or to be cut in half by a lightsaber. They're all a bunch of red shirts to get my peanut butter and my chocolate. Yeah. So anyway, who cares? But they weren't humans; they were robots. So we really don't
it
have
takes
to worry
away the
about it.
ambiguity. That's what's so great about it. Because, like you said, it
Sure.
kind of feeds into the whole fantasy thing where it's like, hey, we're not even gonna give you the viewer any sort of qualms about this, right?
You know, do you think that George Lucas was trying to achieve that level of that lack of ambiguity by suggesting that the stormtroopers are all just clones anyway?
I was almost gonna say that as you were describing. I was like,
Do you think that's what he was trying to do? He failed miserably because that just made it way more morally complicated than it ever was before.
No,
When stormtroopers were just people who signed up to be Nazis, you know, then it felt okay.
Then you're like,
to
oh
just hate
well, they
them.
knew what they were getting into.
Yeah, they knew what they
Whereas
were
now
doing. They knew what they were
they've been
getting
programmed,
into. Now
which-
they're like the product of like scientific.
But if
you
they've
know,
been programmed
like,
and brainwashed, then you could say they're just as morally not
oh,
culpable.
I got you.
Right?
I think that's well, yeah, no, it raises way more ethical questions if they're a bunch of clones than it did for me when they were just space Nazis. Just full stop. And so maybe he was trying to make them morally, you know, extinguishable.
Yeah,
without
they're just robots.
without,
right?
you know,
Because you just think
they're
of
just
like
robots or whatever.
when they get the
Well,
Order
because in the
66,
prequels they are just
in
robots,
Order
right?
66,
You
they
know?
just are programmed to, you know. Now the fact that they can like fight their programming or resist it, which we sometimes see, and I think was that what was the show? Was it Rebels or Bad Batch or something like where you kind of there's people who are like fighting that programming or something?
I haven't seen all of those. I've
Yeah.
seen some of Rebels. I've seen some of. I haven't seen the entire series
I haven't
of
seen all
Clone
the
Wars.
animated stuff
Actually,
either. I've been trying to get my kids into those too because then I won't feel as weird watching them together. But yeah,
well, I've watched. I think like the first season of Clone Wars. I think that it gets much better from what I hear. I'm not saying that season one was bad. It's just that it evidently it's amazing.
Basically,
evidently by the time you get to the end of that season,
students were like
that series.
All my students who are into Star Wars will swear by Clone Wars, and they all want me to watch it or have my kids watch it because they talk about how good it is. And so that's why I keep trying to get my kids to watch it, you know, so that we can watch it together. But they've watched the 9
maybe I'll
episodes.
give it the old college try again.
They've been asking about watching Mandalorian, and I said, oh, I don't. It's not that it's so like violent or so bad that you won't like. I don't think you'd enjoy it as much, but maybe. You know, I've almost thought after I rewatched season 1 to get ready for this, I was like, oh, my oldest could probably like it. They'd probably appreciate it.
Well, I think they would. I mean, I think they would. I don't know.
Actually,
you should give them a go.
It actually had more.
I think it's the best Star Wars product. It's the best Star Wars product since the original trilogy, hands down.
Oh yeah.
I mean, now I guess I haven't seen Clone Wars, but I tell you what, I bet you it's a different vibe. Even from what I've seen of season 1. I mean, maybe this is an unfair statement for me to make.
This is like, but we're just veering off. It's just different. Right now.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah. All right. Whatever.
You know what? I want to. You know what, Jacob? I want to sincerely thank you for doing your homework, but I especially want to thank all of you guys for coming to listen and share in this conversation. Originally, I was thinking we were going to do 3 Mandalorian episodes, and we do actually still have enough stuff to do a third one. But I think, Jacob, would you agree? Maybe we should wait until season 3 totally comes out.
Let's just do after
and then we can do
3.
our season 3 Mandalorian episode. We'll revisit this after having watched season 3. There's definitely a lot more spiritual content that you and I can cover. We didn't even get into the whole father-son thing. We didn't even get into the whole.
No, we keep just. There's so much to do.
Well,
here.
and actually, because I mean, Voyage has a collection of essays that go into the father-son thing, especially. So I thought that could be its own thing. But there's even more from Therese of Lisieux. I mean, her big thing was my vocation is love, and think of how much. Like the love is the main theme throughout all the Mandalorian, of course. So yeah. Anyway, we'll definitely revisit
how much.
This.
Hey, Mike, how much you want to bet Voyage Comics would love for us to mention their new book that is all about what we're talking about? And now we somehow have gone through 2 podcast episodes and have not.
Oh, you know what? I tell them my artistic integrity. This is not a commercial. This is not propaganda. But if you guys have enjoyed this, if you guys have enjoyed this podcast and other conversations about the Mandalorian, about comics, theology, philosophy, of course, go to voyagecomics.com and you can hear new episodes from us. You can see other, products that Voyage releases. You can go to the Voyage blog. If you want to, send Jacob and I a message, complain about Jacob, whatever you want to complain about Jacob, email podcast@voyagecomics.com.
I mean, what's there? I don't know what there would ever be to complain about, but you really no. I will say this: go buy their new book, The Christ Bearer. It's about the Mandalorian.
If you want to complain about how Jacob is just a shill for Voyage Comics and doesn't actually have any thoughts of his own, but is just one walking commercial, then you can certainly email podcast@voyagecomics.com. Like, subscribe, rate, review the podcast. Because again, Jacob is very sensitive. And so he wants to hear all the good things that you're saying about, even if you're going to throw in some good things about me or the podcast in general.
You wish.
Yeah. But anyway, we enjoyed this. We look forward to having another conversation about this, about all the other stuff we have on the horizon. But anyway, we will talk with you guys or see you guys later. Thanks.
My corporate overlords, thank you.
Thanks for listening to Voyage Podcast. The Voyage Podcast is a production of Voyage Comics and Publishing, which seeks to create exceptional entertainment informed by Catholic values that inspire people to live a heroic life. Voyage Comics seeks to advance truth and beauty found in powerful stories. To learn more, visit voyagecomics.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.